Back in 2015, the United Nations made what seemed like a grand but doable commitment to eliminate world hunger by 2030. Although a gargantuan task, most experts agreed that it should be possible. After all, famine deaths have been plummeting since the 1980s. Technological improvements meant getting life-saving nutrients to starving people was easier than it had ever been. And while famine in war zones was still an issue, the Security Council would pass a unanimous resolution in 2018 that suggested depriving civilians of food during combat could constitute a war crime. In short, these were the heady days of optimism, an era when it looked like famine would soon go the way of smallpox or the Sega Dreamcast, a strange relic of a past that's best forgotten. Sadly, that optimism would turn out to be misplaced. Fast forward just 9 years, and the number of people facing critical hunger is rising. In global hotspots from Sudan to Haiti to Gaza, millions teeter on the brink of famine. The one common denominator uniting them all? Well, that's conflict. After decades as a taboo, the use of hunger as a weapon has come roaring back into fashion. As we're about to see, the reasons why range from the deeply cynical to just the truly terrifying. Alright, so if you were to look at the sweep of human history prior to 1980, you might assume that famine was just an inescapable part of civilization, one of those dreadful but avoidable things like wars that aren't so much a bug but rather a feature of life on Earth. The World Peace Foundation, for example, has estimated almost 115 million people died of starvation between 1870 and 1980, mostly as a result of conflict, conquest, or totalitarianism. Prior to that, the data gets sketchier, but any glance at history will throw up innumerable famines affecting almost every continent. But something strange happens when you look at the figures from 1980 onward. After centuries as a fact of life, the number of starvation deaths starts falling sharply. According to Vox, the average annual death toll due to famine post-1980 was 75,000. While that's still a lot of deaths, the outlet notes that it represents, quoting, just 8% of the historical average from 1870s to now, even as the global population nearly doubled. The reasons why, they're not very hard to fathom. On the one hand, we've made significant agricultural advances across the 20th century, leading to far greater crop yields. On the other, a wider geopolitical shift towards democracy and cooperation eliminated the circumstances that characterized some of the previous century's worst famines. Gone were most of the highly personalized regimes that allowed men like Mao Zedong or Joseph Stalin to starve millions of their own citizens. Gone too were the brutal interstate conflicts like World War II that saw hunger deployed widely as a weapon. By the early 2010s, while famines still occurred, they were doing so only in isolated hotspots. As recently as 2016, the UN estimated that the number of people needing emergency food aid was a mere 130 million. Again, it's a big number, but it's a small number by historical standards. That same year, the British researcher Alex de Waal was even able to write an article for the New York Times titled, "Is the Era of Great Famines Over?" Unfortunately, it would turn out that the answer to his question was a resounding no. In an update to his 2016 article published this spring, de Waal noted that the number of people in desperate need of food aid has increased 180% in the last 8 years to 363 million. The main reason? A resurgence of starvation being used as a weapon of war. In his words, many things go into the conditions that create a food crisis. Crop failures, high food prices, unemployment. But it's war that has created the famines taking shape today. And de Waal isn't alone in making this conclusion. British medical journal The Lancet notes that, quote, the destruction of the food supply can be deliberately used to starve people as a weapon of war, which has been more commonplace since 2010. Overall, it's estimated that 2/3 of people going hungry in 2024 live in or are trying to escape war zones. To see this in action, we need only glance at the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC. Developed and maintained by UN agencies working in tandem with several non-profits, the IPC is considered the gold standard for measuring world hunger. For ease of understanding, they break down their measurements into 5 categories: minimal, stressed, crisis, emergency, and famine. A famine classification means that, quoting, 20% of households in a region face an extreme lack of food, 30% of children have acute malnutrition, and 2 people out of every 10,000 in an area are dying every day from starvation or hunger-related health problems. At the time of writing, the IPC places 1.19 million people globally in this famine category, spread across just 3 countries. Roughly 850 live in Mali, around 79,000 are in South Sudan, the other 1.1 million, well, they're all in Gaza. Notice the pattern there? All 3 locations are either ridden by instability and violence, South Sudan, or are active war zones, Mali and Gaza. The same is true for other epicenters of hunger. Of the nearly 25 million people the IPC classifies at the emergency phase, the largest number, nearly 5 million, are in Sudan, where a civil war rages. Globally, Alex Dewall reports that the region facing the worst food crisis is on the edges of the Red Sea, where Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Yemen are all descending towards mass starvation. Not coincidentally, all 5 nations are either in a state of war or recently emerged from one. If that's the case, then we need to ask an important question. Why? Why is the use of hunger in conflicts rising in this decade? And the answers range from the banal to the utterly chilling. Historically, armies have not been shy about using starvation to achieve their goals. During World War II, Nazi Germany was explicit about wanting to eliminate enemy populations via hunger. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union saw about 4.5 million people die as a result of these policies. Those fighting internal conflicts also knew how useful control of the food supply can be. Foreign Affairs recently described the way the Bolsheviks took advantage of the unintentional famines during the Russian Civil War to consolidate their power. As the magazine noted, quoting, famines across Eastern Europe offered the Bolsheviks such leverage over domestic opposition that they even contemplated rejecting food aid from the American Relief Administration, explicitly telling the Americans that food is a weapon. And these are just 2 examples, but the 20th century alone is littered with them. Ethiopia's Great Famine of the 1980s, for example, was in part so cataclysmic because the ruling Marxist Derg regime used it as an opportunity to starve northern regions where rebel groups opposed to the rule were based. Even the US has acknowledged the advantages of controlling the food supply. In 1974, US Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz told Time magazine, quoting, "Food is a weapon. It is now one of the principal tools in our negotiating kit." In that case, Butz was talking about using the carrot of American agricultural abundance to lure developing nations on side, rather than using the stick of starvation to beat them into submission. But it shows how widely acknowledged the idea of food as a tool for achieving geopolitical goals was even recently. The reasons why? They're not that complicated. In an international conflict, control of the food supply can give you outsized leverage. We can see this most clearly today in the Russia-Ukraine war. Since launching its full-scale invasion, the Kremlin has targeted not just Ukraine's ability to produce crops by destroying agricultural land, but also its ability to export them by targeting Kiev's Black Sea shipping. In this case, the goal isn't to starve Ukrainians. Instead, it's to create instability in the global food market, driving prices up and pushing developing countries that rely on Ukrainian grain toward hunger. This creates incentives for those countries to push for a quick negotiated settlement, one that would solidify Russian gains in Ukraine's south and its east. Internal conflicts, likewise, create conditions where starvation becomes useful. If an armed group is embedded in a civilian population, an effective, if extremely brutal way to destroy that base of support is to starve the civilians offering them shelter. We saw this in the Syrian civil war, where Bashar al-Assad's regime launched what it openly called its starvation until submission campaign, stopping food from reaching residential areas where rebels were thought to be holed up. Hunger can also be used to induce an unfriendly population to leave a certain area. During the 2023 blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan cut off all access to the ethnically Armenian enclave in what was interpreted as an attempt to force the hungry locals to flee. In the end, Nagorno-Karabakh fell to a lightning Azeri assault, but inducing hunger in its soldiers and civilians for months beforehand may well have helped hasten the end. Finally, controlling access to food can likewise give you leverage over a civilian population. Do it well enough, and you can effectively hold an entire city or even a whole nation hostage. And that's what's happening in Haiti right now, where armed gangs have taken over the ports, the airports, and roads leading into Port-au-Prince. Unlike Vladimir Putin or Bashar al-Assad, the Haitian gangs likely don't have any grand geopolitical goals. They just want to accumulate wealth and power, and controlling food access points gives them that, even if the result is an estimated 1.4 million Haitians now teetering on the brink of famine. So those are some common reasons why states and armed groups might be incentivized to use hunger as a weapon. But there's also a practical dimension, one that is extremely depressing. Starvation as a weapon has one of the best cost-to-effectiveness ratios out there. Grim as it may be to say, it is extremely cheap to stop food reaching an unfriendly population. During Ethiopia's Tigray War, government forces and their Eritrean and Amhara allies required nothing more sophisticated than fire and machetes to burn swaths of farmland and kill all the animals. Oftentimes, warring parties don't even need to do that. One reason famines often accompany wars is because the instability and violence affect local farmers. As Foreign Policy notes, when a quotidian is marred by violence and uncertainty, farmers plant smaller areas and lower value subsistence crops. They also keep small livestock rather than more valuable cattle. Alternatively, they may outright flee. Once productive land can therefore quickly be abandoned, meaning once warehouses are empty, there's nothing coming down the pipeline to restock them. In this scenario, starving a population can be as cheap as refusing aid workers' visas or refusing aid convoys entry. In Sudan, both warring factions are currently refusing to let aid trucks enter via all but a handful of crossings, thereby all but guaranteeing mass starvation. But it's not just individual bad actors who allow modern famines to take place in conflict zones. It's only thanks to a severely dysfunctional global system that they're able to get away with it. Formed in the wake of World War II, the UN Security Council must have seemed to 1940s folk like the biggest collection of great powers ever seen. Alongside its rotating members, the council included 5 permanent members at the apex of their military and economic might: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, and China. Since then, of course, the Soviet Union has collapsed and its seat has been inherited by Russia. The Republic of China, created by Chiang Kai-shek, has been replaced by the People's Republic of China that was forged by Mao Zedong. Importantly, though, all 5 countries still hold vetoes over United Nations action on any military crisis. Vetoes that help explain why the UN is often so impotent in the face of modern famines. To illustrate, you can look no further than Russia's attempted blockade of Ukraine's ports. Although it created food instability for millions across parts of the Middle East and Africa, the UN was powerless to do anything, as Moscow would simply veto any resolution. On the issue of Gaza, America has vetoed 3 calls for a ceasefire that might have allowed aid in. China, in turn, has vetoed a US call for a ceasefire in Gaza on the basis that it included language Beijing objected to. The result is that the very body set up to police conflicts around the globe and authorize action against rogue states has become a talking shop where Washington, Beijing, and Moscow score points against one another, while London and Paris, which have not used their veto since 1989, simply keep their heads down. Obviously, this dysfunction affects more than just conflict-related famines. But it's a major reason why the world is so frequently powerless to act in the face of starvation. Another major reason is the withering of global interest in regions suffering famine. And yeah, we know, given all the hubbub on US campuses about Gaza, the idea that global interest in starvation is withering might seem a bit absurd. But aid agency budgets tell a real different story. Writing in the New York Times, Alex Duvall notes that until 5 years ago, the United Nations annual appeals for emergency aid were funded to the tune of 60%. In 2023, that dropped to about 35%. To take a representative case, it's been known for many months now that Sudan faces a catastrophic famine this year if aid cannot get in. As recently as January, though, the UN Refugee Agency's Sudan budget has only received slightly over 3% of the money it needed. That situation has since improved thanks to an unlocking of US humanitarian aid and an April conference held by France where multiple nations pledged millions of dollars. Even now, though, the appeal is not close to fully funded. Finally, another major issue stopping the world from uniting on famine relief is that things have got a lot crazier in the last couple of years. Where aid agencies could once send supply ships via the Red Sea, the danger of Houthi missile attacks are now forcing them to take long, expensive routes around South Africa. Infiltration and price shocks related to the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have likewise pushed up the costs of simply getting a crate full of food to a country in need. Combined with shrinking aid budgets, it doesn't take a genius to see that this vital work is becoming much harder. Alright, so those are some of the major reasons why starvation is returning to warfare in such a big way. Now though, we want to change tack slightly and focus on something else: the impact these policies of food as a weapon have on people living in conflict zones. Because while this debate might sound a bit abstract, for people on the ground, it's anything but. In the last 5 years alone, we've seen disturbing examples of what it means when hunger is weaponized and the threat that it might pose for the future. It sounds like a bleak pub quiz question. What is the deadliest war to so far take place entirely within the 21st century? And no, it's not the Ukraine war, although that may eventually take the crown, and nor is it the Syrian civil war, the Mexican drug war, or the chaos that's still gripping Yemen. Rather, it's a war that amazingly took place mostly out of the headlines. A war that devastated the north of Ethiopia and, at its height, may have featured 1 million soldiers fighting on the front lines. It's a conflict known as the Tigray War. Taking place at the height of the pandemic, the conflict pit the rebels of the Tigray region against the allied forces of the federal government, the nation of Eritrea, and Fano militias from Ethiopia's Amhara region. Since the conflict's backstory was super complicated, we're not going to go into it here. If you're interested in learning more, we have multiple videos in our archive on the subject. For today's episode, the important thing to note about the Tigray War is the death toll. Between November of 2020 and November of 2022, it's generally thought that 600,000 people died and possibly as many as 800,000. Of those deaths, a respected study from the University of Ghent estimated that between 300 and 400,000 were civilians. But the majority hadn't been killed by the fighting itself. Speaking to El País, researcher Jan Nyssen estimated that a staggering 60% had died from hunger. These events were the result of deliberate policies pursued by Ethiopia's central government. The moment the war ignited, Addis Ababa blocked Tigray, cut electricity, instituted an internet blackout, and refused to let nearly all aid workers in. Inside the region, their allied forces began targeting food production. The Economist recounts how Eritrean soldiers slaughtered farm animals and burned agricultural equipment so locals would starve. A UN in Crete would later find out that, quote, starvation was used as a weapon of war. Although the Tigray War would have been a nightmare even without the blockade, it's this use of famine as a tool that made the conflict so deadly. And it sort of worked. And we say sort of there because there are multiple reasons Addis Ababa won the conflict, including the timely arrival of UAE and Turkish drones. But the destruction of farmland and starving of civilians certainly helped the government's allies achieve their secondary aims, such as driving ethnic Tigrayans out of western Tigray so it could be annexed into the Amhara region. Another major recent instance of famine and conflict is Yemen, where a Saudi-led coalition instituted an air and sea blockade in 2015 and unleashed an intense bombing campaign against civilians. In this case, the goal was to reverse gains made by the Iran-aligned Houthi movement, which had seized power in much of the north. Unlike in Ethiopia, the blockade wasn't successful, although that only became apparent after hundreds of thousands had died. According to the UN, of the 377,000 who died in Yemen between 2015 and the lifting of the Saudi blockade in 2022, 60% died to, quote, indirect causes like food insecurity and lack of accessible health services, end quote. And to be clear, this wasn't all due to the Saudi state. The Houthis took food aid destined for civilians in their areas and instead kept it for themselves, or simply took aid money and then never delivered on their promises to feed the starving. Combined, the Saudi-led blockade and Houthi corruption plunged millions into misery. By 2021, over half of all Yemeni children under 5 were showing signs of malnutrition, including stunted growth. Fast forward to today, and the effects of the blockade can still be felt. The World Food Programme claims 2.3 million Yemeni kids need treatment for severe malnutrition. Meanwhile, the Houthis, whom the blockade was meant to dislodge, remain in power in the nation's north. This is one of the key points about the use of starvation as a weapon. While it is a cheap and often effective tactic from a monetary point of view, the cost in human lives is enormous. Without the imposition of blockades, both the Tigray War and the conflict in Yemen would have killed far fewer people. You can see this playing out in other conflict hotspots today. For all Haiti's gangs may be bloodthirsty killers, violence on their part alone led only to 4,700 deaths last year. Now, obviously that's still a lot, enough to earn Haiti the second highest murder rate in Latin America, but it is peanuts compared to how many will die if the famine the UN is warning about really does grip Port-au-Prince in the coming months. At the end of all that, an obvious question likely remains. If hunger is such an indiscriminate, deadly weapon, why can't the world do anything about it? And, well, the good news is that we probably can. But the bad news is that it's an open question as to whether our leaders can summon the willpower to do so. If there's one thing recent history teaches us, it's that the best way to stop armies from using a certain weapon is to create a taboo around it. The prime example here is nuclear weapons. Unless something went seriously wrong in the time between us recording this video and you seeing it, nukes have still not been used in wartime since the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. That's not to say there haven't been pretty close moments. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the obvious one, but there are also instances like General Douglas MacArthur pushing President Truman to use nukes in the Korean War, and India and Pakistan reportedly coming close to a nuclear exchange in 2019. In all cases so far, though, the taboo has held up remarkably well. Even when Russia was considering using a tactical nuclear weapon to halt Ukrainian advances in summer of 2022, China and India let it be known that this would cross a red line and Moscow backed down. A somewhat lesser success story has been chemical weapons. While the Syrian civil war featured the chilling spectacle of sarin being used against large-scale civilian targets, most nations have shied away from using nerve agents in conflict. Biological weapons, too, are rarely deployed. In short, it's clear that creating a taboo is the best way of stopping militaries from dipping into the darkest recesses of their toolkits. If that's the case, then would it be possible to make starvation as taboo as dropping anthrax or sarin over a city? Well, the first thing you need to note is that we already tried. Since 2019, starving civilians in a civil war has been officially designated a war crime, yet countries keep on doing it. But we could go further. A recent piece in Foreign Affairs urges that a full-blown international treaty would be a good first step, one that, quote, would define and prohibit the use of food as a weapon in conflict. The article goes into a lot of detail about how this could be enforced, but the key point is that a treaty banning the practice would be a vital first step, and nor would it be the last. To really give this treaty teeth, convictions would have to follow. Assuming this is possible might be naive. The International Criminal Court is famously slow-moving, and proving commanders are responsible for atrocities committed by their troops is an extremely time-consuming process. Even getting to the trial stage can be difficult. Sudan's Ammar al-Bashir has been wanted by the court since 2009 and still hasn't been handed over, despite being overthrown in 2019. Still, the court isn't completely useless. Just witness the way Vladimir Putin was forced to pull out of a planned summit in South Africa over fears local police might try to execute an ICC warrant against him, despite the South African government begging the court to exempt it. Clearly, this is not a toothless system. Now imagine the court starts issuing arrest warrants against leaders and generals who use starvation as a weapon. Imagine heads of state who oversaw famine suddenly finding themselves caged in and unable to travel abroad as they'd wish. Now imagine that one of them finally gets convicted and sentenced. That one of the people behind these famines winds up like former Liberian leader Charles Taylor serving a 50-year prison sentence in a dingy cell in England. Wouldn't that make a difference? Well, maybe it's naive to think so. After all, the nuclear taboo is arguably so powerful only because even guys like Vladimir Putin know that escalation could lead to his own country being reduced to radioactive rubble. Where famine is concerned, it's simply not the case. On the other hand, it would be good for world leaders to at least try and put weaponizing food into the same box as nukes and chemical weapons, because this decade so far has shown a worrying creep towards the return of famine as a tool of war. If nothing is done to halt it now, things may get worse. A senior legal consultant at Global Rights Compliance, Catriona Murdoch, recently told Vox, "You can't make starvation morally toxic without prosecutions. There needs to be a really clear statement. This type of behavior will be investigated, it will be prosecuted, and someone will be held responsible." It's only when we finally reach this point that we may see famine deaths in wartime begin to drop once more.